My name is Stephanie Rowe. I'm the Global Climate Lead Scientist at WWF, and I'm really delighted to be here with you all to be chairing this session focused on resilience. So we're really going to be building on the previous session, and we're going to be exploring resilience concerns, the interdependence of social and ecological resilience, and also ways of enhancing resilience in the face of various pressures, including climate change. So we're going to start with our keynote speaker, Mercedes Bustamante, who will discuss the challenges to implementing NbS at scale in the face of climate change and sociopolitical and economic pressures. Professor Mercedes Bustamante is a professor at the University of Brasilia. She's renowned for her work on threatened tropical ecosystems and their interactions with human-induced changes, including the impacts of deforestation, fire, and drought in tropical savannas and forests. She was a lead author of the 5th and 6th IPCC assessment reports, and also was an author of the NbS report. Mercedes, please come to the stage. Thank you. Please give a warm welcome.
So good morning to everyone. Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to be here today, talking a little bit about the Brazilian Cerrado, one of the most threatened biomes in South America. So we are here discussing nature-based solutions, and one of the main, some of the main challenges that we need to tackle is how to provide food security for an increasing human population, how we can fight climate change by adapting to its impacts, and also how to protect and restore nature. All climate scenarios are pointing out that to limit global warming to 1.5, we need to conduct major transitions in global and regional land use in all pathways in the coming decades. And these transitions, they have a huge impact on tropical ecosystems. Tropical ecosystems represent a large component of the global carbon cycles. They are critical for the global climate systems, but they also are home of a biological and cultural biodiversity. There is growing attention to nature-based solutions. However, the emergence of nature-based solutions has not generated equal attention for all ecosystems. So there are neglected biomes and ecosystems which are under increasing pressure, and some social science call them also sacrifice zones. One of these biomes is the Brazilian Cerrado. The Brazilian Cerrado is classified as a wet seasonal savanna. It occupies around 22% of Brazil's counted area. It's the second largest plant formation in South America. So if you pack together Portugal, Spain, France, and Italy, we can fit all these 4 countries inside the biome. So it has a central distribution. It means that it has transitions to the main Brazilian biomes, like the Amazon forest, the semi-arid region in Brazil, the wetlands in the Pantanal, the Atlantic forest, and even if the grasslands in South Brazil. All these contact zones are areas of high biodiversity. So, and the Cerrado is a mosaic of different vegetation types, ranging from grasslands to forest lands, and the most common types are the typical savannas or shrublands in Brazil. So the typical savanna has a very significant carbon stocks when you consider vegetation, above ground, below ground, and soil organic matter. So, and most of these carbon stocks are below ground, in below ground root systems, and also soil organic matter. So we call then the Cerrado an upside down forest. So, and usually when we think about the importance of tropical ecosystems for the carbon cycle, we have in mind more the tropical forests, but it's important to consider all the savannas in the tropical region. But the Cerrado is much more than carbon. Cerrado is also a biodiversity hotspot, a global biodiversity hotspot. What this means is an area with a huge diversity, a lot of endemisms, but also under a high pressure for conversion. It's also quite relevant for water security in Brazil. It hosts the headwaters of the most important hydrological basins in Brazil. One is the Paraná basin that feeds the Pantanal region in Brazil. This is the large wetlands in South America. but also the San Francisco basin that fits the semi-arid region in Brazil. And it's also the home of a huge social diversity. We have indigenous societies, we have also quilombolas that are community from former enslaved people, and also traditional rural communities. But the Cerrado is now under pressure and facing many challenges related to land use changes. For example, change in fire regime. Fire is a natural component of the Cerrado ecology, but human presence and land use is changing the fire regime. So we saw that plants and communities are not adapted to fire, they are adapted to fire regimes. And when you change the fire regimes, you also change the ecological conditions of the plant communities. The pressures is coming from demands for meat production, grain production, especially soybean and corn, but also the expansion of bioenergy crops in the region. So in the last year, unfortunately, the conversion of the Cerrado vegetation surpassed that of the Amazon for the first time in 5 years. So Brazil is succeeding in terms of the control of deforestation in the Amazon. Unfortunately, we don't have the same success in Brazilian Cerrado. So the biome had the largest deforested area in 2023, totally 1.1 million hectares lost just in the last year. And this loss of native vegetation, the main driver is agricultural expansion for commodities, again, especially soybean, and is concentrated in the northern part of the biome where the less large remnants of Cerrado vegetation are. This is the region, the dots in red, this is the deforestation in the last year, and this is the region that we call the Mato Piba. Mato Piba is an acronym for the federal states Maranhão, Tocantins, Piauí, and Bahia. And this region respond for 75% of the biome's deforestation in 2023. So, and why is the Cerrado an emblematic case? First of all, the ecological relevance, the biodiversity and ecosystem services. Change in land use are very rapid and also very drastic. And the economic and social relevance when you consider in food and energy security, but also the land tenure or the land ownership structure in Cerrado. Why in the Amazon region, most of the land is public, what makes deforestation control a little bit easier because the union can then protected areas or demarcate indigenous lands. Most of the land in the Cerrado is private land. So this means that we really need to have strategies to work together with the private sector. And what is the reality facing the Cerrado over the coming decades? A set of competitive land use, pressures will grow to provide more people with food and fiber, and also we have interactions between local and global environmental changes. So we can say that in the Brazilian Cerrado, we have the convergence of the most fundamental challenges for nature-based solutions that we have been discussing in the last 2 days. So deforestation in the Cerrado continues to increase, putting the biome at even higher risk. Remember that we are talking about protect, manage, and restore land. So, and this is the result of wicked social environmental problems. They emerge from the complexity and the dynamic of socio-ecological systems and are related to uncertainties in the behavior of natural ecosystems. This is one of the topics that we are going to discuss in this panel. The number of stakeholders, vested interests, large spatial scale, and also long temporal scales. So, and some of the fundamental questions that are related to this convergence of challenges, how we can ensure permanence of carbon storage in vegetation and soils, how we can make ecosystem restoration a cost-effective and scalable carbon dioxide removal option, how we can implement climate change action, but considering the integrity of all ecosystems and protection of biodiversity and indigenous peoples and local communities, and how we can organize and enable environment and governance that include also the agricultural sector. And how we can do large-scale deployment of all these options that may face significant ecological, environmental, and social constraints. So one question about the permanence of carbon in this type of ecosystems is important to remember that we consider in the Cerrado seasonal dry ecosystem. So when you consider the annual carbon balance, the Cerrado is a net sink of carbon. But just in the end of the dry season, the Cerrado acts as a source of carbon to the atmosphere. So the annual balance depends of the duration of the dry season, but also depends on the amount of rain during the rain season. These are two aspects that climate change is impacting. And also, we have changes in the fire regime, and if we increase the fire frequency, especially in the woodlands, they could not recover from fire, and they become net sources of carbon to the atmosphere. But there is also not just the impacts of global warming, but also the impacts of large-scale conversion in the Cerrado. So we studied the accumulated effect of historical land use change in the region. And what we saw, this is already happening, this is observed effects, a reducing in annual evapotranspiration by 10%, and also an increase in land surface temperature by almost 1 degree Celsius. So this means that the Cerrado, just because of the land conversion, is becoming drier and hotter. And we also have, you can see here, let me see, I think I have a pointer here. Yeah. This is the Mato Piba region here in black, and we see a larger effect in terms of reducing evapotranspiration and increasing surface temperature in the Mato Piba region. This is what we are calling the agro-suicide. So agriculture is moving to this last frontier, to an area where it's not so suitable for agriculture, but also the conversion is making the climate hotter and drier. And the next question that we made, what are the potential implications of future land use scenarios on climate for this region? We consider three different scenarios. The first one is what we call the Cerrado collapse, so accelerating legal and illegal deforestation. In Brazil, the major environmental law, this is the Forest Code, define the amount of native vegetation that should be kept in rural properties. In the case of the Cerrado, it's 20%, so farmers are allowed to deforest up 8% of the property. So, but even if they have this permit to deforest, that they continue with illegal deforestation. So if you have the business as usual, and you can see here in this, sorry, come back here, pointer here. If you go to the bluish part here, the climate is becoming wetter and cooler. If you go to the orange here, drier and hotter. So if you continue with the business as usual until 2050, the Cerrado is becoming even drier, more dry and hotter. But also if you consider just legal deforestation, that is here in the middle, we still have an effect of land use change on climate, on regional climate. And just the last scenario, this is zero deforestation and restoration, allow us to increase evapotranspiration and also to reduce surface temperature. Also, these impacts of land use and climate change are affecting biodiversity. If you consider that the Cerrado lost in the last 15 years almost half of the native vegetation, and the remaining Cerrado areas are still under intense fragmentation, this means barriers for species migration. So this equation, habitat loss plus climate change plus few protected areas, have significant changes in species distribution and abundance. So what are the landscape strategies for the Cerrado in the coming years? We can divide in the northern part of the Cerrado, where we still have the largest remnants of native vegetation. We still need to protect and to avoid deforestation. And in the southern part of the Cerrado, we need to work on restoration of degraded lands so that we can increase connectivity in terms of the biodiversity, but also the biodiversity in the Cerrado is not equally distributed. We have supercenters of biodiversity in the northern part, in the central part, in the southern part. So if you have just protected areas in the northern part of the Cerrado, we are not protecting the whole biodiversity of the biome. So, and what was the strategy that we are proposing? We have the major land use in the Cerrado is still pasturelands, and most of the pasturelands in the Cerrado are in some degradation states. So we have a demand of 20 million hectares for restoration. This is around 10% of the biomass area and 35% of its pasture area. So what we can do with these degraded pastures and how we can provide some territorial intelligence for the use of this area. So this is then we see how we can prioritize restoration demands in degraded pastures, considering gains in biodiversity and ecosystem services, but also reducing conflicts with agricultural production in the Cerrado. For that, we just mask all the other parts of the biome and consider always just degraded pastures in the biome. And we overlap the different layers in terms of biodiversity of different taxes, different groups, but also ecosystem services like carbon and water. So if you have the red colors here, are the areas where we have an accumulation of different features in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And here, what we did is map the suitable areas for soybean conversion, pasture-converted soybean, to decrease the pressure in the northern parts of the biome. So what you saw that we have enough land represented by degraded pastures in the biome that allows to double the area of soybean production in Brazil. There is some overlap between these biodiversity priority areas and also the areas suitable for soybean, but well-planned land policies can reduce these conflicts between agricultural expansion, protecting other parts of the biome, and also allowed ecological restoration for the use of pastures in the Cerrado biome. But then come another challenges for nature-based solution. This is how we can implement large-scale restoration in these biomes in the tropical region in developing countries. Brazil committed to restoring 12 million hectares of native vegetation under the Paris Agreement. I think 12 million hectares is almost the size of England, if I'm not mistaken. So this gives you an idea. And to fulfill this commitment, what we need is a forest restoration, a forest recovery industry in the country that is not what we need, what we have. So since the last 8 years, Brazil has actually restored less than 1% of this target. So this gives us an idea. Most of these restoration projects are in the Atlantic forest, and this gives us an idea of the challenges, how we can implement large-scale restoration and how we can restore non-forest ecosystems. Another important aspect when you talk about agricultural frontiers, we usually think about empty spaces. But this is far from true. So in this area that we call this agricultural frontiers, is the area where you have a rich social diversity as well. So, and these indigenous peoples and local communities, they are facing pressures from agricultural expansion and densification and also climate change. And it's quite important, as it was mentioned many times yesterday and today as well, it's key that nature-based solutions don't lead to inequitable outcomes, particularly at local scales and particularly for the most vulnerable peoples. So, and some of the conflicts here we have in the middle, this is the current demand for water for irrigation in terms of large-scale agriculture in Brazil. If you go here to the green, to the blue part, this is the higher demand for water for irrigation. And you see, as I mentioned, this is the Mato Piba region, the area that is becoming hotter and drier, and also this is the transition to the semi-arid part of Brazil, and there obviously is the demand higher for water for irrigation. But this also here is the projection of irrigation in Brazil in the next 20 years. So something is not quite matching there, because we are projecting a higher demand for water for irrigation in a region where the climate is becoming hotter and drier. And this is also increased the vulnerability of native populations there. We also have a huge issue with land grabbing. Land grabbing refers to the actions to appropriate large extension of land. This includes not just land, but also natural resources, forest, water, mineral resources. And this appropriation aims extracting resources and also accumulated land. So land speculation is also a huge part of this equation. And we need also to consider also the different narratives. We are calling land grabbing. Other groups are calling large-scale land investments. And and someone mentioned here, I think it was in the afternoon panel yesterday, think about what we are going to do with our pension funds. I think was one of the questions for the people with gray hair, I'm including there. And it's interesting because some pension funds of academic in the US are invested in the Cerrado. the Harvard Investment Fund, the Harvard University Investment Fund, is also related to land grabbing in the Cerrado region. So usually through very opaque ways, but they are also putting money there in a quite sensitive region. So it's important also to consider the role of international trade, development institutions, and government in this equation. But another phase of the land grabbing is what we call the green land grabbing, and is also related to a very perverse component of the environmental regulation. So this depends on how the state regulates appropriation of land that can trigger new forms of appropriation of nature. As I mentioned before, the major Brazilian environmental law is the Brazilian Forest Code. And in the case of the Cerrado, farmers need to protect 20% of the native vegetation in their properties. And if they want to export, they need to comply with environmental law. As they don't have this 20%, they are allowed to use 20% outside the properties. But what are they doing in this region is to appropriate land of traditional communities in the area that conserve the Cerrado, preserve the Cerrado, and they are just claiming land rights over the traditional communities and indigenous peoples. So this is a huge issue. It's a extreme violent conflict in some parts of the Cerrado as well. So, and then we started to think, okay, let's take a closer look in this region. So we selected 4 biodiversity corridors. 1 minute, I run, okay. 4 biodiversity corridors in this region, and just did a literature survey saying what are the communities that are there and how they are using the Cerrado biodiversity. So we, just from the literature survey, we could find more than 600 traditional communities in the area in more than 100 municipalities. So you can see it's a quite diverse group. Most of them are quilombolas, so descendants of former enslaved people that use this region for survival. And also they use more than 700 plant species in the Cerrado. That shows quite a strong connection between social and biological diversity, and the loss of native vegetation thus implies in the loss of useful plants. They use that for medicine, for food security, for a lot of different issues, and add another stressor for these already vulnerable communities. And then 2 of our partners organizations, 2 NGOs, they did several workshops in the region after we did the literature survey, and they organize these workshops trying to find, is there more communities that are not reported in the literature? So what you can see in this map here, the black dots are the communities in the official database, and the green dots are the communities that were mapped through these workshops and that are not in the official database. So if they are not in the official database, they are outside of the influence of public policies. So, and this is an important aspect, so that these 2 organizations co-create with the communities an app. So this calls Tonumapa. Tonumapa, I am on the map. This is an application, so developed by together with the communities, is a co-creation product, and they can then map their territories and started then a process of claiming land rights being recognized by public policies. So just going to an end here. We have their global challenges, but we need regional and local lands. So the Brazilian Cerrado comprises more than 1,000 municipalities with different occupation histories. The highest mean area of rural properties in Brazil is 1.3 million privately run properties. So this gives us an idea of the diversity of stakeholders. Conservation has been conducted through national and local policies, and how we can then reconcile agriculture, biodiversity, conservation, and ecosystems, and thus will require well-informed regional and targeted solutions. And just to finalize, this is an interesting paper discussing the challenge of commodity-centric governance in sacrifice frontiers, and it's the evidence from Brazilian Cerrado soil sector. So they said that sacrifice frontiers, unlike other frontiers, they really represent a ripe risk challenges because they are reported as economic opportunities that may be lost if pro-conservation institutions have their way. And this is why you have such a difficult to have a sustainable roundtable for soy in the Cerrado as we have in the Amazon region. And really, this is my last slide, Stephanie. Here are some points how we can transform sacrifice zones in sacred zones. So sacrifice and sacred have the same origin, the same etymology. So in multifunctional and diverse landscapes. So how we can identify appropriate incentives to reduce loss of natural vegetation, adequate strategies to implement restoration efforts, how we can strengthen territorial planning instruments, giving voices to invisible communities, how we can have incentives for sustainable practices and business, protecting also sensitive ecosystems, remaining natural habitats, and the groups whose livelihoods depend on natural ecosystems. And also that all that preventing the promotion of land grabbing by marketers and investors, and implementing and strengthening the traceability of supply chains. So thank you very much for your attention and the opportunity to be here today.
Thanks so much. Well, thanks so much, Mercedes. That was truly an excellent grounding of a lot of the challenges and pressures, but also opportunities to be able to address those challenges and pressures. So thank you very much. So we're going to have about 7 or 8 minutes of questions. So anybody have any questions for Mercedes before we move to our panel?
I just wonder how you think of engaging the agriculture lobby, which is so strong in Brazil. It's such an important part of the Brazilian economy. And so everything you've laid out is so important for the future of Brazil, the future. But the agriculture lobby is so fundamentally opposed to so much of what you said. So I just wonder how you could talk about those conflicts. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a quite important question. So we are facing now in Brazil a political struggle because we have a federal government that is more to the center, to the left wing, and the Brazilian Congress that is closer to the far right wing. So, and it's really a strong agribusiness sector caucus in the Brazilian Congress. But there are some sectors in the agricultural business that are starting to hear the message and understand, and that is also related to survival of the business. As I show it here, if they continue to go up in the Cerrado, this is a problem for the sector itself. But the point is, when you have such a polarized political environment and agriculture is such an important part of our economies, even the left-wing part of the government is afraid to go against the agricultural expansion because this provides funds for the political and social aspects in Brazil. So we really need to have a strategy that can encompass the divergent voices in the agribusiness sector and trying to show really how we can connect that also to international supply chains. So in this sense, as commodities are especially related to export to different countries, how can we also involve trade regulations in terms of trying to preserve these neglected biomes? I don't know.
Great. Any other questions from the room? I have one question here from online is, how do you imagine a forest recovery industry could realistically be realized in Brazil? And have you seen such industries take root and succeed in other regions?
Yeah, we have experience in Brazil with the restoration of forest ecosystems, but we really need to expand this experience, and this is one of the questions, what type of science we need, how we can restore different types of ecosystems. And some years ago, Brazil prepared a very nice plan in terms of vegetation, native vegetation restoration, including how we can provide seeds, seedlings, livelihoods for people involved in that as part of the national bioeconomy strategy. As this discussion, Brazil is now presiding the G20, and this discussion about the national strategy for bioeconomy is coming again. And Brazil decided to have a bioeconomy based on biodiversity. And maybe this is a way to go. If it really makes us part of the Brazilian economy and the industry of restoration becomes so strong as the agricultural sectors in Brazil, then maybe we have some chance to succeed. But again, this also involves a lot of research and science, because we need to select the species, see how they reproduce, how they propagate, and also how we can restore systems that are resilient to climate change. I think this is one of the big questions.
Thanks. You didn't mention, I don't think, eucalypt plantations as one of the threats for the biome, but I wonder if you've had any experience with those large-scale plantations being compatible with protect, restore, and manage, perhaps if they're established in more degraded areas. Is that a land use that can provide a pathway to restoration?
Yeah, eucalyptus is one of the threats, especially in some of the states. There is close related to the steel industry in Brazil. And this is now an issue because Brazil passed a new regulation that saying that this forest plantation doesn't need more environmental license to be in the field. So this will probably open new areas for forest eucalyptus, especially eucalyptus plantation in the Cerrado, and this is also a huge threat. So that is something that we also need to look at in the coming decades, because Brazil is quite famous for all the technology related to eucalyptus plantation in terms of the genetics. So it's a technological package that is already available so that people can just grab. It's quite different from biodiverse forests that we need to have the seeds, the seedlings. They grow very slowly, and eucalyptus in 7-8 years, we have the biomass that you need there. So this is an important point too.
Thanks so much. That was a wonderful talk. When you talked about potentially engaging with the kind of institutional asset managers and pension funds, is that something that you've done directly, and how have those conversations gone? And generally, do you favor divestment approaches or engagement approaches to dealing with the asset managers?
Yeah, we are involved in different initiatives to engage with different sectors. So really, we need to bring all people on table and try to discuss, even if they have completely different worldviews. This is the point that we need to do that. So how we can probably try to find a middle ground and protect what is needed to protect, and also trying to understand the demands of the different sectors. Many people involved in the agribusiness, they said that we occupied these areas when the environmental regulation was different. We received incentives from former governments to be there, and they are right about that. So the point is to say, okay, but reality is changing fast, and is going to imply in huge change in the way we raise animals, livestock, and also we plant commodities. And I would say that is also a key issue for Latin America in general, because most of our economies are based on commodities and extractions of natural resources. Some social scientists are calling this phase that we are now the neo-extractivism, because all this pressure for protecting other areas are going to put more pressure on these frontiers. But really, I think this engagement of different actors is essential, even if there are some worldviews that are quite difficult and hard to understand. I don't know if I got that.
Terrific. Thanks very much. So we're going to have another Q&A at the end of the panel where you can also ask some of your remaining questions then. So now I'm going to please invite the rest of the panelists up on stage, please. Okay, so I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists that we have today. We have a great lineup of panelists. Pete, you can maybe at the end, I'll start the end there and I'll come over. Pete Smith is a professor of soils and global change at the Institute of Biological and Environmental Sciences at the University of Aberdeen and science director of the Scottish Climate Change Centre of Expertise. He's an expert on climate change mitigation, soils, agriculture, food systems, ecosystem service modeling, and nature-based solutions. And then we have Alejandra Calzada, or sorry, I'll keep on moving from the end there. So Alexandra Desprez is a research fellow on international climate governance at IDDRI. She has been involved in UN climate negotiations, supporting the COP21 French presidency on the Paris Agreement, as well as a negotiator for Costa Rica. And then we have Alejandra Calzada is WWF Mexico's climate change adaptation coordinator. She works with government agencies and local communities in the Yucatan to reduce the vulnerability of ecosystems and communities to climate change, and particularly in protected areas. And then last but certainly not least, we have David Croft, who leads sustainability for Reckitt, which is a leading global health and home hygiene company. He is responsible for their work on environmental and social sustainability worldwide, and working with farmers, communities, and manufacturers across an international supply network. So before I ask the panelists to give their short presentations, I'm going to also provide some additional context to our panel discussion. Mercedes actually framed it really well, and also some speakers in the previous session, that of course it's well known that NbS, nature-based solutions, are very effective at building resilience and increasing adaptation, but that these ecosystems are also affected by climate change and many other pressures and challenges. And so its services are at risk in face of these pressures, including climate change. So the resilience and effectiveness of NbS is also at risk. And it's also the magnitude of the impacts are highly uncertain, because of course we don't know what our actions are going to be. We don't know what the level of warming we're gonna see, because it's primarily based on our actions, similar to sociopolitical pressures and similar to economic pressures that Mercedes laid out. So there's increasing concern. Obviously there's increasing interest of NbS, but there's also increasing concern about some of these pressures and their ability to hinder the delivery or the effectiveness of nature-based solutions to deliver on the benefits. And so I guess there's growing concern on the durability of permanence, for example, and resilience to climate change. And I want to just quickly see here, if raise your hand if you know that there's another conference happening across the street on carbon dioxide removal and negative emissions. Yeah. And Pete actually is participating in both. He's going to be a speaker there tomorrow. So it's interesting because because there's some scientists there that think that perhaps nature-based carbon dioxide removal is maybe not worth the investment, given some of these resiliency issues. And that's a major problem that we need to address. But there's also, I think, some concerns from our community that this concern about resilience is actually hindering investment and hindering implementation of NbS or political support. So I guess one of the main questions that would be interesting to ask is, is there growing concern, and is this valid? And so what are the main concerns? And Pete's going to kind of describe some of the science considerations here. Or is there just increasing awareness on how to address them? Or is it both? Just to quickly show on the finance part, is it hindering investment? We're actually seeing increasing investment in nature-based solutions. I know that there's a finance session happening after this one, but actually since 2021, we've seen an increase of investment in nature-based solutions from $133 billion up to $200 billion in 2023. Where there has been a decrease has been in the carbon markets. And so you can see there on the top right here this is 2021, 2022, 23. You see a dip in nature-based solutions. And both of those are, this represents both the emission reductions and removals here. But I think many of us would argue that this dip is primarily due to the credibility and integrity concerns rather than the resilience concerns. And then in terms of policy support, yesterday it was well outlined that there's increasing support, political support at the multilateral levels, but there's also increasing national ambition and plans for NbS, both within NDCs and local strategies, NBSAPs, for example, as well, and that there's an increasing emphasis on enhancing resilience and adaptive management. So just to frame again who's going to be speaking on what, we're going to be touching on the science and policy considerations of resilience and nature-based solutions. And Pete's going to outline the science considerations, and Alexandra's on the policy considerations. And then we're going to be switching to actually implementation and thinking about how we build resilience, how we enhance resilience in implementing NbS on the ground. And then at the end of the panel, we're going to highlight some of the near-term key action areas where we think we can focus on over the next year or the next year and a half on the road to COP30, on the road to Brazil, to figure out what are some key areas of research, but also policy action and private sector action. So with that, I'm going to invite Pete to give his presentation.
Okay, yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit, as Stephanie said, about the limitations of ecosystem-based carbon dioxide removal and how we might look at the vulnerabilities of the sinks that we create and how we could maybe de-risk investments to make it more attractive for investors. So the first slide I'm putting up is just looking at the full scope of CDR. So this is more to do with the other conference. This is what they're banging on about across the road. There are a bunch of options for carbon dioxide removal, going from geological storage, chemical storage. If you look at these little boxes, there's land-based biological, ocean-based biological, geochemical, and chemical. The geochemical and the geological stores tend to be of longer durability. So the colours there on the time scale of storage are shown on the bottom graph, and those ones that last for tens of thousands of years are the geological and the mineral forms. But as you know, the biological, either the land-based or the ocean-based interventions tend to be more on the decadal to century timescale. So the first one is about the durability. So there's an issue with durability where investors would rather invest in carbon dioxide removers that are giving you really long-term storage. And the other one is to consider the range of options that are available. The ones that are shown as land-based options there are in the light grey, and you can see that nearly all of them are in the land, and there are some in the oceans, which I won't talk too much about today. But a key issue, firstly, is the point about sink saturation. So I've already said that it's not durable. There's also the issue that when you make an intervention, when you plant trees or improve your soil carbon management, you get a short-term gain. You get a really big hit originally in terms of the carbon removal, but then the next 5 years it's smaller, the next 5 years it's smaller until you get to a saturation point or an equilibrium point. So you have to keep doing your good management practice, that change in management practice, even when you stop getting any carbon benefits from it. That's not true for adaptation. The adaptation benefits may persist, but in terms of the carbon markets, they tend to saturate. And the other one, of course, is that sinks are reversible. When you plant trees or you do some other form of intervention in the land or the oceans, then those sinks can be reversible. When you get a forest fire, sweeps through a region, you can lose all of that carbon that you've just taken decades to store, and you can go back to zero. So what we need to do is with our carbon dioxide removal options, we need to make sure that they're future-proofed. And that comes onto this issue of trying to make them, not all carbon dioxide removals are nature-based solutions. You can imagine planting up a single, an even age stand of Sitka spruce, which may gain carbon, may be great for carbon. It's not so great for biodiversity, and it's not as resilient. It's not as resilient for future climate change. It's not as resilient to extreme events compared to planting up a mixed native species stand, which is going to be more resilient and actually in the long term stores more carbon. So it's just taking your carbon blinkers off, which I sometimes have to remind myself to do, and looking more broadly at the interventions that can deliver to us in the future. So you'll recognise this over on the left. So not all carbon dioxide removals are removal options are nature-based solutions. But what I'm banging on about over in the other meeting is that we have to make sure that our CDR is actually a nature-based solution. So it has to have a demonstrable benefit to biodiversity, and we can't just have big companies buying up tracts of land and planting non-native species and saying that's great for carbon dioxide removal, because it's not going to deliver to the people, it's not going to have the local engagement, it's not going to meet those that meet those requirements for a nature-based solution. The other thing that we have to think about is MRV. So this is just something from the soils community where I'm at. We're looking at one element, carbon, and we're looking at one aspect of the component. And it's bloody difficult to do just for soil carbon. So we've got all these components of a different MRV system. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but these components haven't been put together to do this one element in this one component of the ecosystem. But what we need is an MRV system, and this comes back to the first session that we heard about this morning. We need this to account for carbon and for the biodiversity and for the social well-being and cultural aspects as well. So that's where we are at the moment, but we need to have a step change in our ability to monitor and verify. And the investors are interested in this, not only in terms of the carbon, but they're interested in the social good and the biodiversity aspects that we get from the interventions. So this is where we need to go in the future. I'll leave it there.
So I wanted to start off with, if we can just jump right, if we can jump right in to the bigger picture. I thought it might be useful, precisely following up on Steve's presentation, to also give the bigger picture of climate mitigation. We've talked that this is one of the main narratives that drives sort of the broader discussion. And so what is the role? Yeah, so I thought this bathtub analogy could be useful. So basically the water in the bathtub is basically the CO2 concentration currently in the atmosphere. And we see that it's near the edge of the 1.5 limit that is essential when we're thinking about resilient ecosystems and maintaining that resilience. And we see that the tap is still full on. So those are the CO2 emissions that we're still putting in the atmosphere with primarily fossil fuels, and then also, for instance, deforestation and other land use change. And then at the bottom, there's a little bit of a drain with some carbon dioxide removal. So that's sort of the setting. And with regards to CDR, there's a lot of increased enthusiasm, as the other conference demonstrates. And there are also sort of concerns that I think are really pertinent for this community to be really aware of. So it's in that context that with a couple of scientists from IPCC and NbS, we wrote a paper recently in Science where we tried to give some assessments based on recent literature that is not fully captured in the current IPCC report regarding sustainability thresholds of land-based CDR. So bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, for instance, is very much used in a lot of the climate models, but it comes, as we saw, with a number of underlying risks. And so that's why what we found is that the actual low risk level is pretty low. And then also to build off Pete's point in terms of prioritizing more nature-based CDR, so that would be really restoring reforestation that is natural regeneration that emphasizes also biodiversity benefits. We also tried to assess that and found that there is some potential, but it still is relatively low as well. And of course, this is, there a lot of uncertainty, but the point that we were trying to make in this paper was really that we need to be framing this discussion around CDR, which is happening in the climate community, but has a major impact on biodiversity, which is presumably what we care about here in this room. We need to be framing that discussion, starting off with the understanding that there are environmental constraints, and those need to be put at the center and not as an afterthought. So I guess this is relevant when we're thinking about long-term climate mitigation and resilience comes in, because I guess one of the temptations with this growing interest in CDR is that we sort of think that we can have our cake and eat it too, in a sense. So as you might know, at COP28 last year, all countries committed to phase out to transition away from fossil fuels. But there's still a lot of entrenched interests in halting that progress. And so there could be this idea that we could continue to have CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions and sort of pump that up with very large-scale CDR. And that could lead to greater emphasis on sort of land-based CDR, which if it's, for instance, large-scale plantations of bioenergy or of forests, monoculture forests would have a negative impact on, biodiversity. And so in a sense, I think what I've been thinking about is really how do we ensure that we're really at the moment within this global climate policy space, we're at a moment where we can really, the IPCC is clear, we can really choose, in a sense, the future we have. So there's this option, and then there is this other option, obviously. It's very stylized, but the idea is that really, I think, this community, I mean, we care about biodiversity. We understand that ecosystems and ecosystems are both one of the solutions. So for instance, here the key priority is really to reduce emissions as much as we can. So that I think for this community, it's important to understand that phasing out fossil fuels, although that might seem sort of far away perhaps from our daily work, especially if we're working at a local level, it really is essential if we to preserve biodiversity sort of in the long run, to sort of halt those major risks and threats in the future. And of course, also it really emphasizes prioritizing preserving forests. So this idea that we need to really have a mitigation hierarchy where we're preserving those ecosystems and then also scaling up in a sustainable way CDR. And so I think anyways, these are sort of, again, some of the key points. But I guess I would say there's really this opportunity in the run-up to COP30. There's this political sequence internationally that is combining climate and biodiversity. And there are lots of opportunities that we should seize in terms of creating greater coherence, both in terms of national plans for climate and biodiversity, in terms of better integrating this within the next IPCC cycle, and also elevating this message of coherence at the international climate and biodiversity policy space. So I'll leave it at that and happy to take your questions.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity of being here. I'm really happy to be a part of this great panel, and thank you, Stephanie, for leading us into this complicated conversation. So as you said, I work for WWF Mexico, and I have been part of the team for about 6 years now. I've been lucky enough to be a part of NbS projects in coastal areas, especially for adaptation. We are firm believers that NbS is one of the ways to go. It might not be the only one, as you just outlined, but NbS we cannot overemphasize how important they are. And again, we've been focusing on their benefits mostly for adaptation, mostly for coastal resilience. But there's more to that, as we all know. Our main focus has been on mangroves. We know, it's widely known that mangroves store about 10 times as much as some other forests. So we've placed a lot of investments, a lot of resources, and yes, in conserving, we're trying to work with various stakeholders and sectors on how we protect these mangroves and trying to convey how important they are for so much. I'm not going to go into the details of how important that is. And so, yeah, again, we've invested a lot of resources in the conservation aspect, but we've also looked at restoration, and we're actively restoring the mangroves that have been degraded in the past few years and decades. And we have found that it works, that because we have really applied science, and I know that there has been mention of failed mangrove projects and other projects, but we've been really trying to make sure that we don't commit those failures. But what we have learned is that it takes time, A, and B, it's very expensive. So just to give you an example, Over the course of one project that we've been working on, we have been working on restoring 50 or maybe 100 and maybe 150 hectares in one landscape. And while we were doing that, we witnessed a hurricane hit, not in that same landscape, but in the same project. It wiped out hundreds of hectares, multiple hundreds of hectares. And so that was a little discouraging and heartbreaking. It takes so many resources to maybe restore a few dozen hectares where, while climate is telling us, well, you need to be careful because mangroves are increasingly vulnerable to climate change. And actually, there are papers saying that globally, because the deforestation rate has slowed down, now climate is a major driver of change, whether it's erosion, storms, sea level rise. So again, I think to your question, yes, those concerns are valid, the permanence concerns, and we cannot downplay them because it goes back to the credibility question, I think, not just from the demand and the offer side, but the climate resilience piece does play a role. But I've also seen over the course of the project how we are building other forms of resilience and socially, and very much around our mangroves and our ecosystems. And they have to do with social cohesion, and they have to do with livelihoods that are actually emerging very directly related to mangroves. Just an example is there's a group of people that used to be, or maybe have other jobs. Maybe they're a waiter, maybe they're work in the tourism industry, maybe they're fishers, but they're building support for mangrove conservation because they're producing mangrove honey, which is a very special type of honey that has a completely different taste. I wish you could all try it, but it's kind of salty actually. So again, it's the livelihoods, the social cohesion, the awareness about why these mangroves are so important that I think are more than just the value of the physical barrier, the mangroves, that we all say that mangroves are in the face of storms and erosion and sea level rise. And so one additional point that I will make is that yes, nature is vulnerable, but at the same time, nature is also resilient, and it's survived thousands of years. And if we help it a little bit, then the damages can be much smaller. And just an example, again with the mangroves, we know our scientists are telling us that if we act immediately after a certain event, it's much more likely that the mangroves will naturally regenerate than if we wait decades, and it will be much cheaper. And in the last session, there was a mention of a project, San Crisanto in Yucatan, that was mentioned as a good example of social benefits. But I will bring that example up because they recently, and maybe this or last year, they got an insurance policy specifically for the mangrove forests, that is focused on understanding the value of mangroves and understanding their vulnerability. So if a given category mangrove hits in the area, then the community will immediately receive resources to go in and restore the mangroves quickly so that it can recover quickly, because they know it's an investment that they've made and that they've actually also sold to investors. So that's just, I think, an example of how we can plan for and budget for uncertainty and for resilience concerns. Again, ignoring them, I don't think is the way to go, but also just because there are concerns saying that NbS is not the way to go, then it's not black or white. And I think my time is up.
You might be wondering why Reckitt, as a health and hygiene company, is talking about resilience in global value chains, particularly for nature. I'm going to tell you a story about two brands, two global brands. One is Dettol, which many of you will know, and the other one is Durex, which many of you might know. And the importance of those in terms of how that global value chain fits together is what I want to share with you, and how we've been trying to build resilience in the ecosystems and the landscapes that those brands originate from, particularly in southern Thailand and also in India. And that matters because our global value chain is dependent upon it, but also the health of the millions of people who use those brands around the world is also dependent on it. And equally importantly, the landscape and the farming communities are also dependent upon it. And as you've heard today, you know, this link between nature, livelihoods, carbon is writ through all the stuff that we're talking about over these 3 days, and is critically important to getting joined up solutions. And that dependence hasn't necessarily been valued to the level that it needs to be. Gus talked earlier about how nature's been commoditized. It's been commoditized, but it's been undervalued. And that's not just true for business, it's true for the world at large. And we're now coming to recognize the risks that that creates for us. And the question is really, how do we change that? Partly understanding the science behind it, but also understanding the science of change that's going to drive impact and how we connect these things together. And this is a local farm in southern Thailand. It's run by smallholders. They maybe have 10 football pitches of rubber trees. This is one of the locations that we've been working with the team here at Oxford, the NbS team, about how you understand biodiversity, and then also how you build interventions that matter to the community, to the land asset owners, to the landowners, but also to building biodiversity and strengthening resilience throughout that. And that supports Durex. This supports Dettol. This is watercourse catchment area in southern India. Water is our biggest single ingredient. We don't think about a factory in India unless we're thinking about water, because it's nonsensical to do so. Now, I'm not saying we've always thought like that. I don't think business did think that way if you go back 20 years. But now, as we plan to go forward, we have to understand the much more complex or visibly complex ecosystem that we're all part of. And I pick that word very importantly, because we are dependent upon nature, and that's where we drive some of this activity from a TNFD conversation to make change. And it's also about the importance of engaging with the asset owners, with the communities. We can't think about water catchment areas on our own. That's why we work with WWF, but it's also why we work with the farming communities to think very carefully about their needs and their needs going forward. And then it gets down to how do you map all of this? If you don't get to the detail of it, and if you treat products like water or latex as commodities, then you fall into the trap that we've lived with for the last 200 years or so. And this is what has to change. We have to get to the detail that sits behind these global value chains and then start to make connected interventions going forward. And as we do that, we need the metrics to help us. The metrics aren't going to be perfect. The metrics are going to continue to grow. But unless we start to understand the detail that sits at the heart of these landscapes, and I'm going to pay huge tribute to Cecile and Nat and Gus and the whole team at NbS, because this is their work that pulled all this together for us, our ability to drive change, frankly, is non-existent. But that just gives us something to work from. What this allows us to do is to understand the impact on biodiversity, but then to consider with the local asset owners how you can then create change that strengthens biodiversity, but continues to support their livelihoods as well as picking up carbon. And the risk in all of this is that historically we have always tackled these things individually. And that's a fundamental flaw. Maybe it's something we're set up to do as a race, that we tackle the problem in front of us, whereas now we have to tackle at least 3 things together if we're going to get complementary solutions that make a difference. And that's what this is about. This is sandbank engineering in southern India. This is building, with the help of the local community and the local government and local NGOs, new water catchment area programs that make a difference to us downstream, but actually make a huge difference to that community that's increased, frankly, the levels in boreholes by 7 meters in one monsoon season. that means they've got better agriculture and the chance of 2 crops per year, maybe even 3 when they only had 1 if they were lucky. And even the extent that they can now have a fish farm, which they couldn't have imagined before, and they sell fish to fund the local school. This starts to become the sort of connected solution that works at a local level and at a global level. But, as my friends at WWF would say, it is no good if the only person doing that catchment area management is Reckitt. And that's why we also need joined up policy solutions to draw these different strands together. And so for us, it's about how do you build these connected interventions with local land stakeholders so we meet their needs, but we also build long-term resilience. And it's a long-term resilience that both they and us are invested in. We're increasingly exploring how you shift this conversation to an ecosystem services payment, because I think that gives longevity. It means what we're actually doing is decommoditizing that supply chain. And there's an increasing amount of evidence, if you look at the work that Lombard Odier, which is a Swiss investment bank, believe it or not, are doing, that talks about how decommoditizing it and adding value back in from nature and carbon and social impact raises the land value for the smallholder. It increases their equity. That's a massive impact for them. But it also means ecosystem services payments gives longevity of solution. So to the point that Pete was making earlier, you have to keep these tracks running. All too often in the past, we've commoditized some of the solutions. The voluntary carbon markets commoditize carbon in a way that doesn't create longevity and links, I would argue, to actually the nature-based solutions that sits behind it. But we can evolve that and make it more connected as we go through. This is just a summary of all the headlines across the top of those slides. But our goal around this is to create measurable impact through engagement across that value chain, and the BIM system helps us to do that, but it has to be supported by an enabling policy framework. And a risk-based approach isn't necessarily going to drive the global biodiversity framework, but we need global policy frameworks to bring public sector actors, private sector actors, and blended finance together to make all of that happen in one go. I have to stop. We'll take some questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much for those excellent interventions. It was really nice to see go from science to policy to field and then to supply chains. So thanks very much for your perspectives on that. I'd like to set an intention for this Q&A because we have quite a healthy amount of time for this Q&A session. So I actually want to open it up as a conversation maybe rather than a Q&A, because I acknowledge that there's expertise and a diversity of views in this room that we'd also really like to tap into. And so rather than having it be a one-way conversation, I'd really like to open it up to a two-way conversation. So I open not just for questions, but also if you have comments on your own or points that you'd like to make in addition that could complement or clarify or question or whatever it is, some of the points that have been made on the panel, I welcome that as well. So I will open it up to the floor, and then also I noticed that there were 5 hands or so that were remaining when Mercedes ended her Q&A. So welcome to ask Mercedes questions also on her presentation. And maybe what I'll do while you guys get your juices flowing over here, I know that this is the last session before lunch, so bear with us, but I guess maybe to start the conversation and to talk about markets a bit more and incentives and maybe just get our juices flowing with some of the debate is how do you incentivize longevity, resilience in different finance mechanisms, in supply chains, in conservation? What are some of the policy tools and options? What are some levers that we can have within businesses and within policy? So I'll maybe open it up to David.
Yeah. I think the first thing you should try and do is not incentivize short-term solutions. And sometimes the way that policy
and particularly policy around disclosure and transparency has driven the conversation, is to incentivize a short-term solution that means people go and buy loads of carbon offsets because they want to downplay their carbon footprint. You've heard an awful lot, even in this panel, that nature-based solutions take longer. But it's a very basic behavioral trait that if you think you're going to get beaten up, you go and try and do something that stops that very quickly. And so people have gone and bought carbon offsets. I don't think it's the right way forward. We don't buy offsets. We abate first and then we try and offset second if we have to. But the critical conversation is how you then build it into an inset approach and how you then have longevity through to it. I think what we're seeing in the framework around TNFD helps to do that. I've spent a lot of time with TNFD. I'm on the task force for TNFD over the last 2 years. And for us, the question there spins from, if you define, as we will have to, a nature-based financial risk, then straight away you need to think very quickly how you're going to demonstrate how you're managing that and how you're measuring it, hence the BIM study. But also then, what are the interventions you're putting in place? Are you funding them? Do they have longevity? Do they have the right level of impact? And that way you start to create longer term solutions that have credibility, which the investing market sees. And what I'm seeing particularly from investors is a significant push into nature-based solutions. Yes, to manage risk, and that's not the perfect solution, but certainly to drive people towards more thoughtful long-term solutions. Our biggest investors said to me, how are you going to quantify this very quickly? And if we don't do it, then these are people who have 5 billion in our shares. Trust me, our CEO takes notice of that.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, I think transparency and integrity are two important factors, but I would like to put another issue besides market. This is maybe the large investors are governments. So, and this issue about subsidies. So we still have a fossil fuel industry that receive a lot of subsidies from governments. And also we have an agricultural sector that's heavily subsidized. This is natural because food security and so on. But if you put subsidies, and subsidies are collective money, it's public money, it's money from people. So we need to ask for some safeguards. So we need to have some environmental safeguards and social safeguards and so on. So I think we are discussing about markets and private sector, but we also need to have the public sector accountable and where they are using our taxpayer money. So for some types of industry that are highly polluting industry. So this is.
Anyone else? Otherwise, I'm going to go to the audience. Yep. Please go ahead. Yep. Keep your hands up so that I can see maybe.
Thank you. Hello. So resilience is obviously really difficult to measure, whether it's long-term resilience to natural disasters. As a result of that, I think historically the focus of NbS has been on carbon-heavy ecosystems. Mangroves is a good example. Seagrass, kelp forests, coral reefs, these aren't commonly part of the conversations we're having. So given that resilience is super difficult to measure, and some ecosystems have the carbon sort of fail-safe to go to, like, oh, but there's loads of carbon here as well. How do you expect to sort of integrate resilience and prioritize that over carbon when it comes to implementing nature-based solutions?
I'll just comment something and you let me know if it sort of answers your question. But we are trying to, I don't know if actually measuring resilience is what we're doing, but we are doing very dedicated efforts on monitoring mangroves and how they are being affected by climate change and in turn how that is affecting the provision of ecosystem services. So the way that we're doing that is working with a bunch of very top-notch academic stakeholders that are already setting in place monitoring systems. And what we're doing very specifically is we're trying to identify those patterns of to what extent mangroves are resilient or to what other extent they're vulnerable. And the idea is that we collect large-scale amounts of data, and that we're actually using it's sort of like an experiment, because we're using artificial intelligence, because we're hoping to collect huge amounts of data that no human would be able to assess on their own. So it's just an example of the things that can be done. Hopefully it'll be an experiment that yields some good lessons for the wider community. And eventually our intention is that we have enough information that we can provide decision makers on, well, these are the patterns, these are potentially the thresholds, and then some recommendations of what to do to address that. And so it's just a piece of it. There's much more, and it doesn't get much into this. Well, it does touch onto the carbon fisheries and coastal protection services. So I guess it does add to the social conversation as well. So more on that in a couple of years, hopefully.
I guess I'll try to make an answer to the first and second question, if I remember them correctly. I think from the climate mitigation policy perspective, one thing that is really needed, and I think really connects back to this question of resilience, is to have greater nuance in terms of the actual, what we're talking about. I think there's the level of sort of superficial understanding at times of what is, like, for instance, even this term afforestation, reforestation, it really brings together both monoculture plantations, which are, don't have biodiversity benefits, and climate, not so much climate benefits, and are not resilient, and also natural regeneration. So even just being very clear about what we're talking about and which of those methods we actually should be prioritizing, I think would be very helpful for advancing the discussion and within like international climate policy. And I think this whole concept of resilience, I mean, also within international policy, there's a greater push towards bringing together adaptation and mitigation, which have historically been addressed separately internationally. And so I think focusing on resilience and exactly what needs to be prioritized would be very helpful.
Excellent. Yeah. So I'm going to paraphrase your answer that you gave when you were sitting in this chair on the last panel, which is it is really difficult to measure resilience, but we can get started because we've got enough knowledge of ecology, of different systems, different ecosystems to know what sort of factors confer greater resilience. We can't guarantee that they're never going to be reversed or there's going to be no risk, but we can de-risk them by what we know already, and we can get started whilst we figure out how to prove that resilience. So don't dive in feet first, because we've got to make sure that we tick all these boxes that we're delivering to water, health, climate, well-being, people, biodiversity, climate change, all of those things together. But we can get started. We don't have to wait until we've figured it all out. I'm sure you'd agree that we can get started and then work it out as we go along.
And in the same line, I think was in the presentation this morning that the perfect is enemy of the good. So even if you don't have all the information, I think we have enough information to establish some of the indicators of resilience. But I think one important component being an ecologist is really to understand how disturbance regimes are changing, because resilience is also related to the frequency and intensity of disturbance. So, and for that, we also need this better monitoring efforts. So, because systems are going to respond different a long time if the regime are changing, and especially we didn't mention that, but the impacts of extreme events on ecosystems is not just the global warming mean increasing global temperature, but also extreme events that are becoming, as you mentioned, for mangroves and so on. So.
I'd like to thank the panel for the presentations and the conversations. So on this topic of resilience, I think it's really good to take us a step back and work out what do we mean by resilience. Is it ecosystem resilience or social resilience, or the interactions between the two? So from where I'm sitting, what's sort of missing in the debate is this idea of the social drivers of ecosystem degradation. Is it poverty? Is it income? What is it? And I guess it's a question to the panel and to everybody is, do nature-based solutions really address those social economic drivers? So if I can give a real example, for example, in the communities that I speak to in kind of the rural parts of Kenya, bordering the cities, for example, is what's their ambition? What do they want to do is, you know, they want to take their kids to school, so pay for school fees, put food on the table. If they're small-scale farmers, farming is really not viable anymore. So what do? They sell up the plot of land or build high-rises so that they can generate rent. And that's what spreads urbanization. So how do we address those real things that are driving degradation? And is NbS the way forward, or is it multiple solutions? Thanks.
Thanks for your question. Maybe I'll take two more, and then we'll bring it back to the panel. Back in the back there, please.
Maybe just to add on that, because if we're talking about social resilience, you have to consider also that implies that the social structures are gonna be changing constantly. Ne? If you want to reach resilience, then you are not talking about that one specific factor. They're gonna change jobs, they're gonna change ways of livelihoods and everything. So it's also going back into the question of how are you quantifying it. If you're first dealing with production of coffee and then cattle, and the same landscape changes, the livelihoods of the population changes, and actually that's an increase of resilience. You want to give them alternatives, no, not stay in one. So is this long-term thinking has to come with all these changes attached to it, and especially when talking about social resilience. So it's the more long term, you have to vary much more the ways of living, the ways of livelihoods. How do you deal with the land, and how many actors are going to come into the topic per se? Just to add a little bit into the consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe one up there on top, please.
Thanks. So a question about timescales. So often, 1 year is about, say, what if we restored this forest, and like in California, and then a fire comes and it burns down, and poof, up all the carbon goes back into the atmosphere. Do we think enough about the counterfactual? So what if that wasn't designated as forest land use, and it was agriculture, then there wouldn't be a forest that can recover over time. So, my question, I think, is around how do we think about longer timescales and, ecosystem recovery, natural recovery, which also, would take up some carbon again, besides all the other benefits that they provide. Another example might be, if we say, oh, but what about sea level rise? It seems risky. Let's not restore mangroves here at all. As opposed to restoring mangroves there, and yes, then there's a chance at least that there can be landward migration. So I think that kind of tension between shorter term views and yes, there is, kind of immediate urgency that we need to, take as much carbon as we can out of the atmosphere right now. And issues around durability, and for sure there are things you can do that would actually, are irreversible. So maybe there's, a regime shift or some change of state, and then it was a waste to invest in a certain thing. But I'm just thinking kind of in policy and in approaching these questions of looking at BECS or ecosystem restoration or carbon, all these different options. How do we think about time, and how do we kind of account for those fluxes or variations over time and for natural recovery? Thanks.
Thanks. So I'll pause there and turn it back to the panel. So we have questions on social or ecological or interdependence of both resilience and its dynamicism over time, and then the issue of timescales and how we deal with that for durability and planning over time as well. So hand it to you, Pete.
Yeah, I'll take the timescale one first. I think there is a conflict here that comes up about the timescale, because net zero is a pressing need, and we need to get there by mid-century, which puts the emphasis from the carbon. People are thinking about carbon community. getting to net zero because we're in big trouble now. We've only got the remaining carbon budget we're going to be spending we're going to be spending all of that in the next 5 years or so. So we're going to need more CDR. So that focuses people who are only thinking about it with those carbon blinkers on what are we going to do by 2050. And then maybe that's when you say we go for BECCS, or we go for the very fast growing trees, and who cares if they're not native, we need to get that carbon out of the atmosphere. So the Paris Agreement puts a sort of it puts the focus on the need to do it quickly. But I would argue that a more resilient system, which could be nature-based, which would get us there a little bit later, is worth doing. And as Alexandra said, we need to put more effort into the conventional mitigation, the emissions reduction. So I would say that if we're going to use these nature-based solutions as to address carbon dioxide removal, we need to make them resilient. We need to make them co-deliver to a whole bunch of other things, and we need to accept the fact it's maybe going to take a bit longer to do that, but not to make incorrect decisions just because we got a 2050 target in our head, and we're thinking that we got to hit that.
Mercedes, yeah.
I would like to address the question about poverty and social struggles. I think this is a key for this issue. So inequity is a central point of all this discussion, and is also a quite important point for the UNFCCC negotiations, because of this huge empty promises that developing countries made, and funds that are not there yet for loss and damages and all this issues. So, but I think this is economic and social inequity is key for that. But as a word of caution, I think working with communities, when you talk about social resilience, some of the communities say we don't want to hear that anymore, because when you talk about resilience, this means that you have to pass through this struggles, and some of the communities, they have to face that year after year, and they say don't talk about resilience. We would like to avoid all these issues so that we don't need to be resilient. So sometimes the word we use, something as good resilience, but for a lot of communities this means suffering, and this is how we can avoid that they have to go through all these struggles. So I think this is the key point before we talk about building resilience. So how we can really avoid loss and damages. I think this should be one of the priorities.
Yes, so just perhaps to build on what Pete just said, I think the question, I think the importance of keeping the short-term urgency, and also looking to sort of that 2050 horizon is really essential. And it's something that I think there's still a huge opportunity to be filled. And again, I'm speaking more on the climate mitigation side. There's the climate plans that countries need to put on the table, which they need to do next year. That will be for the 2035 horizon. But there's also the long-term strategies that the Paris Agreement invites all countries to do. And yet there's still lack of alignment there, and also still very little thoughts into aligning those long-term climate strategies with biodiversity. So I think through these policy instruments, if we were to take those and really use them as sort of starting points to force this discussion of a greater integration, I think that would be really helpful. And I totally agree with what Pete said.
Did you want to add to that?
Just a quick additional point on your point about interdependency and poverty and nature. It's fundamentally connected. If you're a smallholder farmer and you don't have a lot of land, the easiest thing to do to increase your income is to chop some more forest down. And that's what smallholder farmers on palm are doing. And given that something like 45%, give or take, of palm oil comes from smallholder producers, not thinking about socioeconomic solutions that blend to that is frankly, fraught with disaster. I think it also comes back to what we were saying a little bit, and which Gus also said about the previous commoditization of some of these products. If we stop thinking about palm oil as a kilo of palm oil or a kilo of latex in my case, or a ton of cocoa in lots of other people's cases, but you think about it as both that crop that you are then going to further process, plus the value of carbon or the value of nature that is associated with it, then you do decarbonize the market a little bit more. And you again get preferential vertical engagement with farmers, which gives them longevity of trade, but also at an enhanced price. And that starts to make a big difference. I wish it was a silver bullet, because you've still got to tackle the very fraught policy issue of land tenure, which is terribly challenging in many parts of the world. But even that's possible with tenant farmer activity, with the right policy framework. But it goes back to one thing I said earlier. It's very easy to make quick judgments and policies that don't connect those 3 or 4 different things together effectively. And I think resilience stems from an effective, supportive policy framework that joins things up, because otherwise we'll tend to tackle things individually, and that's not the most effective way to build resilience long term.
Thanks. I'll open back up to the floor, and I also have a question here online, which is, how can we avoid over-financialization of nature-related industries? And then related to that, another question was that commoditizing nature and biodiversity could have a negative impact on land value, or positive, depending on how you look at that. What about legitimizing NbS as an investable asset class for sustainable finance investment, for example, ESG aligned? Are you aware of any actors following this narrative? So I think I will hand that off to you, David.
The second one, you'll have to remind me of the first one because I listened to the second one. The second one, yes. I mean, I think we are creating a new asset class, and we are seeing it. I mean, that said, we're still seeing a lot of quick offset type based solutions. I mean, I've had 3 emails today about planting trees and voluntary carbon markets. It's a pretty normal day. But equally, we are seeing more thoughtful investment about longer term. And I mentioned Lombard Odier, which is a Swiss investment bank. If you don't know them, seek them out. They've done some great value chain work on coffee in Kenya, in truth, and also cocoa in Latin America. And what that starts to do is just revalue the crop, the product, plus carbon, plus nature, with social impact on it. Now, to your first question about, does it decommoditize? Does it commoditize?
It just says financialization.
It is really difficult to avoid bringing this down to a dollar sign or a pound sign. I'm a big fan of multiple capital models. I see a lot of opportunity through them about how you sort of see things connected. But the catch is we live in a free market economy, and bringing it back to cash also motivates it in other ways. There isn't a right or wrong answer.
Great, thank you. And that also seeds some of the conversation in the next session as well. So I'll open it back up to the floor. There in the middle.
Hi, thank you. I want to address resilience on a bigger scale because going back to Mercedes' presentation, thank you very much. You packed a lot of information and that was really helpful. One of the things you mentioned was that there was a moratorium on soya in the Amazon, and there's a possibility of that which is being resisted in the Cerrado as well. And I take it from that perhaps the Cerrado is being exploited more because there's been a focus on the Amazon and an effort to protect it. So the focus for exploitation has shifted somewhere else. And the bigger issue is we live in this economy which is based on endless growth, and we're on a finite planet. And until we address that issue, there can be no real resilience. We can restore a forest, we can plant some mangroves, but if there's endless growth, they're going to be exploited again in future. So that is the conversation I think that needs to be had. We, as I think David, you just said, we live in an economy-dominated world. We actually have to change to a world which is primarily based on ecological realities, not economic madness. The only place in nature where endless growth occurs is the disease we call cancer. and cancer kills its host. And that's what we're doing on the planet today. We're killing parts of the earth, and one part gets depleted, like the Highlands of Scotland where I live, and then the focus moves on somewhere else. And now it's in the so-called poorer countries of the south, the ones which have intact ecosystems. So if we want true resilience, we have to change the system.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Thanks for making that. And there was a question right here.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I wanted to say thank you to Alexandra first, because your paper on the risks between different removal techniques was loved by all the NGOs who have been trying to have that conversation with government. And having that paper, which was in Carbon Brief and got all over the place, was really, really helpful. So thank you. The question I had, a lot of us in the room are trying to have a conversation with government in the UK, which has set a net zero policy that is based entirely on cost optimization. So what's the least cost way of meeting the target? There's nothing really on trade-offs in that, and risks and resilience in that discussion. And we've used Alexandra's paper and lots of other means to try and have that conversation. I just wondered if any of you feel the dial is moving yet and you're seeing that kind of change happen. Because that would be really interesting, particularly from other countries, to be able to say to the UK government, actually, there's a different approach that's starting to come through. Thanks.
And one over there, please.
Hi, my question is for Alexandra. I'm from India, and 75% of our energy demand is met by burning of coal. And in COP26, India agreed to phase down the use of coal rather than phasing out, because we have to support 1.4 billion people in our country. So I would like to ask you, what kind of policy tools or incentives should be there at global level so that it helps India to meet its net zero goal, which it has set for itself in 2070, to meet them earlier, like than the set date. So what do you think could be some of the policy tools at global level that could help India? Thank you.
And then the last one up here in the front, and then we'll take it back to the panel.
Thank you, panel, for a really wonderful set of presentations. I'm going to put Pete on the spot here a little bit, and also the panel, but because you're going back and forth between the two meetings, to the rest of the panel, are there key questions you think that Pete should be planting over at the other session that would help them open up the discussion space to grapple with some of the things that we are here? In addition to Alexandra's great work, what other questions, particularly on the social side, should we be asking at the other event?
Excellent. Okay, so we have systems, we have embedding resilience and trade-offs and risks, we have the tools for net zero, policy tools for net zero, and then we have CDR conversations. So maybe, Alexandra, why don't you take the policy and tools that was directed at you, and then Pete, and then I'll open up the other two.
Yes. So thank you so much for your question. Indeed, so I'm not an expert on coal, but what I do think, I mean, we're talking here about the run-up to COP30 next year, which is like the next big COP. And one of the things that actually in the COP28 big decision that came out of COP28 last December was the notion that there is the 3 COP presidencies are going to work together around, in particular, around enhancing international cooperation to precisely accelerate mitigation and adaptation, and to, yes, so I think the question of enhancing cooperation and really ensuring that developing countries have the tools to both invest more easily in sort of renewable energy and also to get away from coal, that is essential. So I think there needs to be a greater discussion internationally in terms of how to bring about those enablers. So it's like the cost of capital is much higher in many countries. And yes, so that's essential, and happy to continue the discussion after. And with regards to your comment or question, with regards to what are other countries sort of taking this issue together? I mean, my dream would be really up to COP30. I've observed over the past 5 years a lot of sort of growing discourse around climate and biodiversity together, and I think the rise of NbS is really part of that, and I think has very positive elements. I think this question of trade-offs is often ignored. And to me, I would really, for instance, at COP28, I saw countries like Colombia and others really starting to emphasize sort of the risks of CDR and the risks of not looking at trade-offs. I would really love if by COP30, there could be a coalition of countries and other actors really emphasizing sort of viable pathways for both climate and biodiversity that don't just emphasize sort of the win-win solutions, but really take a broader picture.
Yeah, so I characterised the people across the road as carbon blinkered nerds, really for your entertainment. But that's not the reality. The reality is there are people working on engineering solutions, direct air capture and carbon neutral concrete and all that sort of stuff, who don't overlap with this group. But all the people that I speak to over there who are working on land-based systems, they do get it. They do get the fact that we have to think more broadly than just carbon, that we have to get resilient interventions, ones that consider people, one that's consider biodiversity and other aspects. So I think we're not as far apart as you might think, and we're pushing on an open door. But we do keep having to have that conversation. Keep reminding when somebody starts talking about carbon, just drop it into the conversation that there's more to life than carbon. That's what I try to do.
So then we're going to go to the systems change and transforming systems, which actually links very much to the first session yesterday and the need for transformative NbS, right? And then what was the last one? Oh, I think that's it, actually. And also this issue of embedding resilience in trade-offs and risks.
Yeah, I can start. I could agree more with change in systems. So I really understand this is a necessity. And when you talk about market instruments, we need to remember that market put us in this situation that we are right now. So and even when you talk about energy transition and phase out of fossil fuel and our dependence of electrification of our economy, this is going to put the pressure on mineral resources. There are also mostly in the global south and in native ecosystems. So we need to think how we are going to do that. So I think one important aspect, even if when you think after the pandemic, we could not reach a global agreement between governments and industry about the exchange of vaccines for developing countries. So I think this is a huge point. So how we really are going to address the inequalities and the difference in power that we have. So, and the market is another power, but actually the geopolitical issues are also quite important. So, and I am really concerned when you talk about commodification of nature and market instruments, because we know how this is going to end in our regions. So I really think we need to try to enforce other mechanisms, other instruments, and other ways to negotiate that. So this.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think we all fully agree with your comment about the fundamental shift that as a society we need to do, and also I think it goes back to the social justice and environmental justice question. And just as an example, we are working with small communities that don't so much use forests for commodities. They're not necessarily changing land use for agriculture or for forestry, but they do need space for housing. So as things are, because they are staying within a protected area, because that's where they have always lived, but the space is limited because they cannot grow. The community cannot grow anymore physically because it's within the core area of the protected area. So there are multiple families that live within one household because they're not allowed to have their own homes. So again, it's a matter of social justice, because at the same time, there's land use change happening, just miles away or kilometers away. But for large scale investments that for some reason have been allowed to happen and continue to allow to happen. So it's the way that the society is structured is just flawed, and I don't know how you can fundamentally change that, but I think we all want to do that. Hopefully we'll find a way.
I'm constantly reminded these days of stuff that Tim Lang did a while back on food value chains, and he talks about the shift from a productionist model, which is a slippery slope and is increasingly proven to be no resilience and not having longevity and have adverse impact. But then oftentimes we tip into a second model, which is a very technophilic model. And I don't always believe that technology is going to solve the answers, going to give us all the answers for these. And so what I would look for is a much more ecologically balanced model that gives you nature and people at the heart of some of those solutions. And, to Pete's point, it will take longer, but I think it can build resilience into it. It's one of the conversations we've been trying to drive, even at COP, to say we need to think about the impact of climate change on people, not just the planet, because that, I think, helps us to internalize some of these challenges. And it was reassuring for the first time to see health ministers and a health day at COP last year, because I think that's a good step to bringing people and nature to the heart of some of these challenges that we're talking about today.
Wrap up here, but before we do, I did want to just quickly compliment what Pete said about the CDR piece. So I think that they are thinking about some of these concerns, but it often is in the frame of trade-offs, which is unfortunate because it's usually a post hoc analysis rather than actually building these types of co-benefits or what I would say core benefits up front, because you need to really embed them in planning, in developing the actual projects themselves at the initial stage rather than later on. And so I think that that is a really key piece, both in the scenarios modeling, because right now one of the things that we did in the State of CDR report, for example, was a post hoc analysis of which scenarios are sustainable. Whereas the whole point is, why don't we ask the modeling community to actually develop scenarios that are already sustainable rather than having to evaluate which ones are, and then yeah. So I think that that's a really critical piece, is to make sure that that comes up front rather than later on. So with that, I just want to thank the panelists, and before we close, I want to ask you, each of you, for one or two key action areas that you think are priorities for either research, policy, or the private sector in terms of facilitating, addressing resilience, and increasing the take-up of NbS to the road to COP30. And I'll start with Pete.
So my key action point would be for ourselves and for us to help policymakers to get out of their silos, because I don't know anything about health or these other aspects, but there are people out there who do, and it's by working with them that I can start to understand it more holistically. That's what we need to help us policymakers do too. So that's the thing. It's a nexus. I hate the word nexus, but it is a nexus. Climate, water, and everything, and all that sort of stuff all together. We need to take that approach to tackling it. And just as a final point, I'm going back to the carbon dioxide one after lunch because it's much easier.
Much easier because they don't look at the full picture. I guess what I would say in terms of COP30, one thing I'm thinking about is really how do we continue elevating these scientific, at the level of science, but to inform policy. So I think informing the next IPCC report to address what you just said is essential. But up to COP30, I would love to see sort of scientists really collectively elevating this voice of saying we need to have these constraints taken into account at the beginning and really put policymakers with this in front and say, I mean, we need to stop pretending that we are in an unlimited world, and phasing out fossil fuels and protecting forests is not an option. It needs to happen, and perhaps keeping in mind these actual constraints, I would hope would be a way to force them to look at that.
I'll say the one thing is to finance, budget, and plan for unexpected, and for resilience and for repairs.
Yes, for policymakers, no more empty promises. So really show what they have to do. And I think for science and thinking about silos, even the IPCC is divided into different working groups. So we need to connect mitigation and adaptation more. This is the reality we are facing. So, and also when we talk about finance, and this must include both aspects so that we don't have mitigation jeopardizing adaptation and vice versa. I think that's...
I'm going to take Pete's point and build a bit. We need to embrace the complexity and not just tackle one thing, but tackle three things of carbon, of nature, and the interdependency with people in this. And we also need to leverage policy frameworks and markets to make that happen. And then we just need to do something. We need to do it quickly.
Terrific. Well, I want to welcome, thank you very much for the panelists. Give them a warm applause. Thanks so much.